Okay, so good morning, everybody. Um, Welcome to this webinar on behalf of the Center for Jewish Civilization. For those who don't know me, I'm Jonathan Lincoln, the director of the Center for Jewish Civilization here at Georgetown School of Foreign Service. And it's a great pleasure today to welcome Dr. Carmit Valensi to discuss the situation in Syria, more specifically, Israel's actions inside the country and what its short and long-term goals might be. Dr. Valensi is, of course, among the more qualified analysts to help us think through these issues. She's a senior researcher at the Institute for National Security Studies, INSS, as many of you know it, and the head of the Northern Arena program there, based in Israel, Tel Aviv University. She specializes in contemporary Middle East affairs, strategic studies, military concepts, and terrorism. She's the co-author of a book entitled Syrian Requiem, The Civil War and Its Aftermath, published by Princeton University Press in 2021. Dr. Valensi earned her PhD in political science at Tel Aviv University, and she was also a research fellow in the Fox Fellowship Program in Regional and International Studies at Yale University. On a personal note, I had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Valensi and some of her colleagues at INSS during a Georgetown faculty visit to Israel and the West Bank in December. And we spoke literally days after the fall of the Assad regime, and we all found her insights immensely helpful in helping us understand this very complicated regional picture that has evolved so quickly since October 7th, 2023, of course. So Carmit, welcome, and just to let our audience know how this is going to proceed, I'd be grateful if you could maybe speak to some of these issues for about 20 to 30 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up for Q&A from the audience. Just to the audience, please use the Q&A function, which is hopefully enabled at the bottom of the Zoom menu to send your questions, and I'll do my best to ensure that we get all of these questions answered. So without any further delay, please, Carmit, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan, and good morning, and thank you for the invitation. I am glad to have the opportunity to share my thoughts on the rapid developments unfolding in Syria. Obviously, recent dramatic shift in the country have changed the balance of power that has defined the country over the past decade. And so far, uncertainty remains a defining feature of Syria today. I will try to delve into the current situation in Syria, the way we see the developments there, and then we can move to, I will try to explain the Israeli policy towards Syria as of today. So I will try to share with you PowerPoint, some slides. Just a second. Okay. So I will start by saying that the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the rebel group takeover of Damascus, was the result of a combination of circumstances that basically resulted in what we call the perfect storm. So first of all, the attack caught the axis of resistance at a critical weak point, following prolonged fighting with Israel, particularly after the recent operation that was called Northern Arrows. And then we started to see that a significant portion of Hezbollah and other Shiite militias in Syria had to move to Lebanon, while others were neutralized due to the Israeli intense attacks there. Iran was preoccupied with addressing Hezbollah's setbacks and limiting its ability to send fighters to assist the Syrian president. And Russia, of course, was heavily invested in Ukraine and offered just limited support to the Assad regime. We think that, Russia witnessing the Syrian army's collapse, Moscow concluded that the chances of changing the situation and saving Assad were slim. Meanwhile, the Syrian army, despite years of rebuilding, it basically proved itself dysfunctional and weak. So all these developments together, I would say, fueled by deep tension in Syria, highlighting the growing rift between the ruling elite and Assad. Many of the population did no longer trust the regime ability to handle the offensive. And this led to widespread army defections and celebrations across Syria as people expressed relief, at being like freed from Assad oppressive rule. So this is the way we can explain and understand the rapid collapse of the regime. I would say that, and this is my main conclusion, perhaps it would be a good idea to start with it. I think that it's the situation in Syria. It's yet too early to determine where Syria is heading. So on the spectrum between moderation and inclusive government versus Islamization and radicalization, it is clear, it is still unclear which direction the new regime is going. And the current picture is mixed, and this is something that it's important to emphasize so we can find indication that pointing on in both directions. When it comes to future scenarios for Syria, I believe we need to discuss two dimensions. One, which I've just mentioned, is the ideological nature of the regime, again, ranging from moderate to extreme. And the second dimension relates to the structure of the Syrian state. So the question would be, will Ashara, the new president, succeed in reunifying Syria under a central government? Or are the challenges are too great, leading us to witness a deeper process of fragmentation, violence, and chaos in Syria? So one has to do with the nature of the regime, and then its ideological tendency, and then the second one has to do with the state structure. Having said that, so we've been seeing that the regime has been taking several stabilization efforts I would say, even in a rapid way. It appointed a new government, established for the first time in the Syrian history the National Dialogue Conference, even managed to draw a temporary constitution for Syria that will be dominant in the country for the next 5 years. The president has been working to unify, the different factions, the different areas in Syria into one consolidate and one state, and putting a great effort to mitigate the sectarian tensions, the internal tensions that are in Syria. And in addition, it's been putting great effort in order to reunify or to rebuild the new Syrian army, the militant militias and groups that has been operating in Syria for years under one umbrella, under one military and security structure. The regime scored much success when he managed to reach a ceasefire agreement with the Kurds, basically arguing that, so the basis of this agreement is that the Kurdish Autonomous Administration in Northeast Syria will be part of the new unified Syria, and gradually the SDF, the Kurdish Syrian forces, will be integrated into the new military and security apparatuses in Syria. There is a lot of question marks around the implementation of this agreement. But this is a good start for Ashara, and it's basically another step in his stabilization efforts and process in the country. Having said that, I think it's hard to maintain the same optimism after the bloody clashes in Latakia, western Syria that we've seen targeting the Alawite community, along with the horrific videos of violence, abuse, and torture. So obviously, again, the picture is mixed, and it wasn't like a sectarian conflict that the new regime forces decided to launch attack against the Alawite community. That was not the case, and it's important to be emphasized. It was a surprise attack by pro-Assad militias, but by pro-Assad, for the former president, forces that were trying to undermine the legitimacy and the efforts of the new regime in Syria. And of course, we all know the terrible result of this. According to some reports, there were about more than 1,000 people who were killed by this incident. And I think that it's interesting to see, in spite of the terrible consequences of this event and the fact that it's a very bad situation for President Shara. Basically challenging his efforts to stabilize the situation and to project this moderate and pragmatic figure. So interestingly, his first reaction to the event was to condemn the massacre. He sent humanitarian aid to the affected areas and even announced the establishment of a state commission of inquiry to investigate the events and prosecute those responsible for harming innocent civilians. So on one hand, as I said, there are many indications for stabilization efforts, pragmatism, and moderation. On the other hand, we can see events like this, and unfortunately, I'm not sure that that will be the last time that we see something like this. I think that the recent event against the Alawite clarified that even if Shara may genuinely intend to improve the situation, it faces several challenges. First of all, this incident highlights its fragile grip on the country and its inability to control forces acting on his behalf. So most of the atrocities that were committed against the Alawite community were attributed to SNA, the more pro-Turkish group that probably is more independent than, and less like subordinated to the new forces and the new regime. And as I said, Shara basically faces significant challenges today in Syria, challenging his attempt to again to act in a much more pragmatic and moderate manner. It's important to emphasize that its inner circle includes numerous extremists who are reluctant to abandon the jihadist ideology. Something that we view with much concern is a phenomena of foreign fighters serving in the army, in the Syrian army, likely with a jihadist background. And this, of course, could exacerbate trends of radicalization. And again, we can assume that the violent that we've been seeing last week has been done by some elements like this, like those foreign fighters. So I think that the more pressing question, and this is something that we've been debating in Israel quite often about the true nature of President Shara, but I think that the more pressing question is not whether Shara is moderate or not, but whether he has the ability to control the different factions and to assert authority. So overall, I would say that, measured stabilization efforts are underway, but the risk of rapid deterioration remains. So we must also, not just reflecting the Israeli perspective, but I think that we must also be prepared for the scenario in which the new government's effort fail, leading to further fragmentation and chaos in Syria. I haven't mentioned the economic crisis, the Israeli presence. We're going to talk about it a bit later, and other challenges urgent challenges that Shara needs to cope with. So our interim conclusion so far, and we've been conducting a thorough study at the INSS that basically aims to monitor the different steps and measure that the new regime has been taking so far in the last 3 months. So our main conclusion for now is that we see more signs of moderation and stabilization efforts rather than, an attempt to turn Syria into a jihadist country or radical and extremist with extremist elements. But we also acknowledge the fact that this phase could only be temporary, short-lived, and potentially revert to extremism. As I said, measured stabilization of efforts are underway, but again, the risk of rapid deterioration still exists due to all the challenges that I've mentioned. The regime in Syria is still in a process of shaping itself, and the duality that we currently see and pragmatism allow for influence from external actors. So we believe that a proactive policy could be effective in terms that he has the potential to influence Ashara's in his inner circle way. And of course, as I said, the main conclusion again is that it's too early to determine where Syria is heading, and it's still essential to monitor each and every step and to, in order to avoid blind spot in our strategic analysis. And this is that I can share with you that I have a lot of argument with the officials in Israel about the nature of the new government. And I think that the most prevalent perception in Israel is that Ashara is fooling everyone, and it's only a matter of time until he will reveal his jihadist face all over again. And again, in the institute, the team in our program, basically after conducting this study, we see it quite differently, and we believe that the picture is more complicated. And again, that it's too early to determine where everything is going. So we need to be patient, and we need to be open to different options. But I'm jumping to the conclusion already. So let's move on to Israel. As I already, I think, hindered, in Israel, there is a strong tendency to question Shara's true intentions. Many, including within the political and security establishment, doubt Shara's sincerity and see his pragmatism as a necessary step toward accelerated Islamization. Obviously, the bloody events that we've seen against the Alawite community could, support this claim. And as for Israel, after fighting wars on multiple fronts for over a year, Israel concerned, I would say even highly concerned, that unrest in Syria could spill over into its territory. From Israel perspective, I would say that a negative scenario in Syria includes the emergence of a hostile Islamist jihadist regime, alongside the formation of a broader Islamist bloc in the region. So there is a perception, and I think it's being supported by some partners in Jordan and in Egypt, that fear that Syria will turn into another component within a broader Islamic or pro-Muslim Brotherhood camp, consisted of Turkey, Qatar, affiliated, of course, with Hamas as well. So there is a fear that Syria, even though Ashara has no Muslim Brotherhood orientation, but Turkey will be that influential and dominant in Syria that it could push him towards this direction. And this is something that, so on one hand, the most positive thing is that the weakening of the Shiite axis in the region, not just in Syria or in Lebanon, but there is a fear that we might see the emergence of a competing camp, which is not necessarily positive from the Israeli perspective. And of course, the scenario, that everything will collapse in Syria, and we see instability, chaos, and violence that eventually will spill over into into our border. And also, there is a fear that this within this chaotic environment, that would serve as a fertile ground for Iran and Hezbollah to reemerge, to reestablish their footholds in Syria. So in terms of the Israeli policy, I think that Israel implemented a policy based on three key principles. First of all, boots on the ground. Israel decided to take an immediate military step and to seize control of the demilitarized buffer zone from the agreement of 1974. This is one element. At the beginning, statements in Israel were very clear about the the fact that it's only a temporary step. But meanwhile, it seems that, I hear a different tone, and it seems that officials in Israel basically arguing that the military presence in Syria will continue for the long term with an unlimited time period, depends on the situation on the ground. There was another phase in this policy, and then which Israel decided to basically define southern Syria as a demilitarized zone. And basically the practical meaning of it is to ban from the new security forces under Ashara to enter this area. The second element is, of course, the massive airstrike that Israel has been conducting in Syria. It was very significant and prominent at the beginning of the events, and Israel claimed to destroy 80% of the weapons that were under the possession of the Assad regime and its forces. The main goal of these strikes is to prevent a situation of which strategic weapons in Syria will fall into the hands of radical elements. Again, we're not sure about their identity and their intention toward Israel. So Israel decided to also to act against the strategic weapons that still exist in the country. And the third element, less military, but more in terms of soft power, means Israel decided to strengthen the ties and the relations with the minorities in Syria, in particular with the Druze community. It's important to emphasize the Druze community is not an homogeneous one. We're talking about approximately 700,000 Druze that are in Syria, with different perception both to the new regime and to Ashara. Some of them have a huge mistrust vis-a-vis Ashara. They fear that they're going to be butchered and will be a target for the new regime, as happened with the Alawite. But others are more positive and willing to give the new regime opportunity. Therefore, I don't know if you've heard recently, but there were many statements by Israeli officials, including the Prime Minister and the Minister of Defense, supporting the Druze quite loudly and even threatening the new regime that if they will harm the Druze community, Israel will attack them. It was a bit, I have to say that I was a bit surprised to see these kind of statements. So what I'm trying to say is that the picture is mixed, and not all the Druze are in favor of this approach. Some of them, of course, are very happy and appreciate the Israeli support, but others fear from being turning them into Israeli collaborators and basically deciding for them to choose the Israeli side over the Syrian side. So it's a complicated issue. I think that you can see here the list of at least the way I understand the Israeli interest in Syria. I think it would be better for us to have a stable and moderate regime that could control the situation, that can secure the border arrangements. Of course, that they will prevent Iran and Hezbollah re-entrenchment in Syria. We wish to see a cooperation with international agencies to eliminate non-conventional weapons, chemical weapons that still remain in the country, and the protection of ethnic minorities. And perhaps, and this is very interesting to see, that along with the military campaign that Israel has been conducting in Syria, it does not rule out future engagement with the regime. The question is whether the current policy aligned with this long-term plan, and we can, debate on that. And finally, I would like to share with you the way I see if we decided to continue in the long term with the same policy towards Syria, I think it has some risks that we should put on the table. So obviously, Israeli action in the country, including territorial control and military operation, are widely perceived as aggressive and, undermine Syria's sovereignty. What concerns me is that we might strengthen extremist group by fueling anti-Israel sentiment. So again, it's important to emphasize that Israel is not on the top of the agenda of the new regime. They were quite restrained in their discourse toward Israel and cautious, stating that there is no intention to enter a military conflict with Israel. So I believe that there is if we continue to maintain the military presence, we might change the situation in terms that we will turn ourselves into an enemy, while the situation is not necessarily like this, at least not as for now. We could also, the current policy in a way erodes the legitimacy of Syria's new government, which struggles to assert control amidst the Israeli activity. We already see criticism from opposition in Syria to the regime, arguing that that Ashara is weak and is allowing new president allows Israel to gain foothold in Syrian soil without doing anything to avoid it. It could also escalate opposition from local Syrian population with growing protests. We already started to see protests, and of course to draw international and criticism and potential. This is the most important issue, I would say. There is a potential for Turkish clashes with Turkey. Again, Turkey is going to be a very dominant actor in Syria. And we think that we expected to see expansion of Turkish forces on the ground, not just in the north. And this is raises the chances for potential clashes between Israeli forces and Turkish forces, and this is of course something that is against our interest. I'm sure it's against Turkey's interest right now, but this is important to again to mention it. So we conducted we wrote several policy papers at the INSS. I will try to summarize our main policy recommendation. We believe that Israel must balance its military actions with diplomatic initiatives and moderate messaging to clarify it has no long-term intentions to remain in Syria. We're not there to occupy the Syrian territory. It's only temporary, I think, until things will stabilize. I think that we should be more clear and to put clear conditions that will allow eventually Israel to withdraw its forces. So we need to be clear of what the reality that we wish to see near our border. And to have this framework of understanding with the new regime. Therefore, it's mandatory to have channels of communication with the new regime. I don't think that we would be able to secure our interest and to avoid clashes in Syria if we're not communicated with the new regime. And of course, with Turkey. I mentioned several times that Turkey is gaining more and more prominence and dominance in Syria. And again, if we wish to secure our interest and to avoid clashes, so we have to initiate some channels of communication with Turkey as well, even though the relations, are in a terrible shape, especially in light of the war in Gaza. So yeah, I think that the Israeli and the Syrian side must agree on set period of border stability with the new regime preventing infiltration into Israel. And continuing, I haven't mentioned it before, but its effort to block Hezbollah's arms smuggling to Lebanon are highly important. So we need to see that this is the direction that the new regime is planning to continue with. And perhaps in the future, as I said, we still don't know what is going to be emerged in Syria. We need to be open to both options, both to the negative scenario that I've mentioned and also to a positive one. And perhaps after many years, we find a partner on the other side. So we need to be open to the opportunity to engage in the long term diplomatically with the new regime and hopefully to have hummus in Damascus someday. I will stop here and I will open it. Would be happy to hear some comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carmit. Really fascinating presentation, incredibly enlightening, and a lot of food for thought. And thank you for that very Israeli aspiration, as you mentioned, of eating in hummus in Damascus one day. Hopefully, that is the goal. I'll invite the audience to write questions in the Q&A function, and maybe I'll get things started while people consider some of their questions. I think you sort of mentioned it, and we also pay attention to INSS publications as well, and we see that there's been a lot of emphasis on this latest publication on sort of Israel's new security doctrine, especially in light of October 7th. So in terms of what we're seeing, maybe vis-a-vis Lebanon, and the ceasefire that's still sort of managing to hold there. And then, of course, the situation in Gaza, which we see the ceasefire is sort of collapsed or in the process of collapsing. Certainly, we see significant escalation on the ground there. How do you then put Syria into that context in terms of what Israel's doing? Is there some sort of logic to how Israel's approaching its borders from now on, or is each context somewhat different?
So that's a great question, and I'm glad that you asked it because I wanted to mention it and I forgot. I think that in order to better understand our policy in Syria, which again, I think I made it clear that it's controversial, we need to go back to October 7. I think that the events of October 7 is a huge trauma for the Israeli people, for the Israeli decision makers in here. And this is highly influenced our policy vis-a-vis the different countries and different boundaries and borders that we have. And I've been told several times by officials that we will not be in a situation of new threats being emerged under our nose and eyes without doing anything to prevent them. So Israel, I would say, of 2025 is much more proactive actors and more, to some extent, even more assertive and aggressive in its military efforts to prevent military threats to emerge. I think that the fact that after being in such a historical weak point of October 7, we managed to improve dramatically the situation and to gain significant military achievements in different theaters. You mentioned Lebanon, to some extent in Gaza, against the axis of resistance in general. I think that Israel has regained its self-confidence in a way and its ability to project power and deterrence capabilities. And these two dimensions, the October 7 and the acknowledgement of our power and deterrence capability together, I think leads to what we currently see on different theaters.
No, thank you. Thank you so much. And I'm actually, there are a number of questions, so I won't take too long, but I'm reminded of our discussion back in December in which we felt that in some ways the ongoing crisis in Gaza is in some ways sort of holding back Israel from realizing the full potential of the gains that it's made in other theaters in some ways. Do you still see that to some degree, especially now with the return to fighting in Gaza?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you well. Can you please repeat the question?
Yeah, we were just talking about the that with the return to fighting in Gaza, that the situation in Gaza, the lack of planning, the lack of a sort of future scenario there, at least in the short term, is that undermining in some ways the gains that Israel seemingly made in Lebanon and Syria potentially?
So yeah, we can argue about whether things were handled under a coherent strategy and clear policy. Obviously, there is a huge debate today about that in Israel. But I think that when it comes to the northern arena, and I heard many officials even in support this argument, we had a sequence of tactical successes and successful measures that we took. So the case, for instance, with Hezbollah in Lebanon, there wasn't a clear strategy, an organized strategy that led us to, basically inflicted a severe blow to Hezbollah. But there were some opportunities on the ground. There were some tactical opportunities that Israel could implement in order to improve the situation there. So one of the criticism toward the Israeli policy here is that we're not necessarily working under a clear strategy, but enjoying, I would say, or taking advantage of tactical opportunities that are on the way. And luckily, when it comes to the axis of resistance, and again, Hezbollah in particular, we scored much success. However, one of the main criticism remain, the fact that we need to have a more It's not just a clear strategy. I think the main problem in the different fighting fronts in Israel is the ability to translate our military achievements into political long-term settlements and gains. We cannot, rely in the long term on our military forces and military capabilities. We need to know when to stop and when to translate them into diplomatic achievements. And this is the main issue, I would say.
Very well put, and a very compelling argument. So I'll just read in the order that I've received. We have several questions already in the chat. So what does a constructive Israeli role in rebuilding Syria practically and realistically encompass? And how likely is it that the current government will pursue this objective given the lack of strategic planning on other fronts?
So I think there are many aspects of which Israel could play a constructive role in Syria. First of all, the fact that we have already, military presence there, I would say it creates a leverage to Israel. But again, now we need to see how we can translate this military achievement into more long-term strategic diplomatic gains. I think that if the burden of proof is still on the heads of Ashara, on the shoulders of President Ashara, and in case that he will continue to take stabilization and moderation measures, we will not challenge Israel. He will continue with his strained and cautious policy toward Israel. I think that definitely Israel should. First of all, as I said, to enhance and increase the communication with the new regime. And in the near future, as we all know, Syria is facing a severe economic crisis, and Israel has a lot of experience and knowledge and technology that it could provide and to be part of the effort to support Syria in the reconstruction effort. So again, if the new regime proved to be a positive actor in this neighborhood, so Israel definitely has the constructive could play a constructive role and has the potential to be part of the reconstruction process. This is just one example of how we can do it right.
And then another question here. What makes you think Israel isn't simultaneously pursuing diplomacy with the new Syrian government? Do you know, is there any indication of engagement?
Yeah, I can only assume that there is a sort of a certain level of engagement with the new regime, but nothing too dramatically, nothing too significant. And when we see the policy on the ground, I mean, we prefer to deliver messages through the media rather than on back channels in a more sophisticated and classified manner. And I'm sure there are some channels of communication, but I don't think, as far as I understand, I don't think that they're well coordinated, and we see different, I can give you just example, the way we define the news. People in Israel, some officials still call them HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or Julani. Others call them Ishara, and of course it bears a symbolic meaning. It's not just a terminology issue. So we need to be more clear in our messaging, and I think that we should acknowledge that is the new president in Syria, and Syria is not going anywhere, and we need to increase if there are any channels of communications, so it should be much more significant that what's currently is going on. I'm sure that the discourse is more concentrated in the operational military issues rather than strategic and political issues, and I think we should move that way.
And then maybe to sort of go deeper into that, you mentioned the engagement with the Druze community, for example, in southern Syria in particular. How does that relate to is this more about internal Israeli politics? Is this some sort of nod to the Druze community that has been, generally speaking, somewhat unhappy with the Netanyahu government for various reasons, the nation state law and things like that? Or is there some sort of change in the community in the Golan Heights? I mean, what is this? Maybe you can unpack this engagement with the Druze, or is this just a natural elite, ally that Israel sees some potential?
Sure. So I think that, amid the uncertainty and instability, and there are so many unknowns today in Syria, I think that Israel viewed the Druze community as a familiar actor, as a positive actor with the potential to be our ally and a positive ally on the ground. And it's very important, again, due to the fact that we're dealing with new actors, with new factions, with new forces on the ground. So the Druze, there was a collaboration with the Druze in the past. Part of it was in the Good Neighbor Initiative, of which Israel provided a humanitarian aid to local population in southern Syria, including the Druze population. So Israel viewed them as a positive element on the ground that could, have cooperation with. I think there are many shared interests between the Druze community in Syria to Israel. Both parties are reluctant to see radical elements entering this area, reluctant to see the re-establishment of Iran and Hezbollah there. And of course, as you mentioned, there is the dimension of the Israeli Druze in the Israeli Golan Heights. And there are I actually visited last week in Majdi Shams, one of the Druze cities in the Golan, and met them with one of the sheikhs there. And he told me that the relations are a flourish between Israel and the Druze community, and they highly appreciate the sympathy that Israel, the support that Israel provide them during the past year. There was this terrible disaster of which the Hezbollah's launcher rockets that hit Majd al-Shams and caused the death of over 10 young Druze children. And they were overwhelmed by the way that Israel embraced them and supported them after this incident. And now with the Israeli statement supporting the Druze. So I think that the Druze community in Israel are much more eager to see a greater Israeli intervention in Syria. They highly encourage the Israeli officials to act a dominant role vis-a-vis the Druze community. As I said, I think that the situation is much more complicated in the Syrian side, because they do want the Druze, some of the Druze there don't want to be perceived as Israeli collaborators, and some of them wish to give a chance for the new regime. So it's a complicated issue. It has to do with the situation and the good relations that we have with the Druze in Israel.
That's great. Thank you so much. Okay, going to the audience again. So how is it that the new regime tolerates Israeli military operations on its territory? How does Israel differentiate which forces are trying to obtain weapons and attack them and avoid hitting the regime's forces?
That's an excellent question. I keep asking myself the same thing. I mean, I've been, following the statements, the Ashara's and in his team statements toward Israel. And as I said, it's very restrained and very cautious. And Ashara himself said it several times that they're not planning and they have no intentions to enter a military conflict with Israel. And at the same time, Israel is controlling a certain territory in southern Syria, striking the country on a regular basis. I think that Ashara has much more pressing challenges to deal with in Syria. Domestic is more focused on the domestic challenges and issues. Minorities, Hezbollah's attempt to operate from the country, the drug industry in Syria, the Captagon, and is more occupied with asserting control and legitimacy. So the last thing that he needs is to open another front or to enter a military conflict with Israel. So it's all question of priorities. And I think that it's in a way is not ruling out future diplomatic relations with Israel, according to his statements. Again, it's hard to tell what it's real or not right now, but according to his statement, he's open to the possibility of engaging with Israel. Obviously, the question of the Golan Heights remains open. So I think that he has other pressing issues to deal with rather than to risk by, challenging Israel and entering a military clash with her.
Thank you. Okay, a question about Turkey. Can you say more about Turkey's interests in Syria? Do they want to establish a potentially permanent military presence in Syria, or just increase their economic hegemony, in quotation marks, over Syria? And how could Israel and its partners engage Turkey and direct things more in the direction of shared economic interests?
Sure. So Turkey, again, is one of the most important actors today in Syria. Turkey supported the rebels against the Assad regime for years throughout the civil war. Now Turkey is reaping the benefits of its involvement. We clearly understand in Israel, and I think the international community as well, that Turkey is expected to have a central role in shaping Syria's future. So I would say that over the years, Ankara's policy in Syria has been motivated by two main interests. First of all, reducing the Kurdish autonomous region and pushing its perceived threat away from the Turkish border. And the second interest has to do with the 3.5 million Syrian refugees currently in Turkey who pose economic and political burden on the regime. So interestingly, just before Assad collapsed for the last few years, Erdogan was eager to bring Assad back to the negotiation table and to reconcile Assad, like other Arab countries and other countries in the region. And Assad turned him a cold shoulder in his regular stubbornness. We know Assad. I'm sure he regrets this attitude right now. And I think, but the current situation in Syria also suits Turkey's President Erdogan nationalist aspiration of positioning Turkey as a regional power with various levels of influence. So what we currently see is that Syria is becoming more and more involved in the military reconstruction, for instance, in economic rehabilitation. And there is a great concern in Israel about whether Turkey will act or be the new Russia in Syria, in terms that now it will have the ability and the military assets, including air defense systems. And this military presence by Turkey could pose some limitation on the Israeli freedom of operation. So there is a fear of that too. Therefore, I think it's inevitable for us, again, even though the terrible relations today between Turkey and Israel, if we want to avoid clashes and mitigate tension, then we have to find a way to communicate with them about our interest, about our red lines in Syria. This is something that would definitely be useful.
So on cue, there's a question now about Russia. So is there the question is there a white paper circulating in the Israeli government that advocates a return of Russian forces to Syrian territory? I think there was some reporting on this possibility. So possibly to counter Turkish intentions to set up bases.
Yeah, that's a very interesting development, and I was surprised myself to hear this report. But I will try to explain the Israeli logic and policy behind it. I think that again, we talked about the unknowns in Syria and the uncertainty and the fear of Turkish dominant role in Syria. There are some circles in Israel who believe that it would be better for us to maintain Russian presence in Syria. So we're specifically talking about these two military bases that Russia has in Western Syria, Khmimim air base and Tartus naval bases. And the question is now, the Russians are in negotiations with the new regime and Turkey, whether to keep their forces and troops there and to maintain those bases. Even though Russia is a terrible enemy of the new regime and HTS, of course, after bombing them for years, the pragmatism that Ashara has been shown so far basically allowed them to have this dialogue with Russia right now. So I will not rule out the option that Russia will remain in Syria. From the Israeli perspective, as I said, I think there is an attempt to find way to balance the Turkish dominance role in Syria by having more actors to be involved in the country, and Russia is one of them. So from an Israeli perspective, some would prefer to see Russian presence on these military bases and not Turkish one. So why is that? Because again, Russia in a way, it's the devil we know. We used to have a coordinating mechanism with Russia. We have channels of communications that prove to be quite beneficial and useful. So this is the logic, but I hope that, officials in Israel clearly knows what we're dealing with and question the Russia's intention to secure the Israeli interest. We've all aware and remember the tightening relation between Iran and Russia and the strategic alliance between them that eventually influenced Israel. So we need to be very cautious in the fact that when some argues that we should rely on Russia as a constructive and assign her a constructive role in Syria.
Sure. No, thank you. Okay. And now a question on the U.S. So can you expand on avenues for the U.S. to support Israeli objectives in Syria? How do Israeli policymakers view the debate on withdrawing U.S. forces?
So first of all, for the US, I think that Syria is far from being a top priority, and it's likely that the US will withdraw its forces from the country in the near future, and probably prefer that other actors, again, like Turkey and Israel, take actions there. We view it with a high concern. I mean, the American withdrawal that we're talking about, approximately 200 American troops in Syria today. And we understand that a potential withdrawal of these forces could, influence the situation with the Kurds, of course. And even though they managed to reach an agreement with the new regime, I think it has to do a lot with their fear that U.S. is not going to be in Syria in the long run. Therefore, they decided to make some concessions and to have this agreement. It could also lead to encourage the activity of extremist groups such as ISIS and in a way undermine efforts to stabilize Syria. So from an Israeli perspective, there is a clear tendency and preference that the US will maintain its forces there. And from until things will stabilize, but I think that we all understand that this is not the new administration direction. And from a Syrian perspective, interestingly, Ashara has made some positive statements towards Trump, claiming that he's the only leader capable of bringing peace to the region and expressing confidence in his ability to lift sanctions. So from the American perspective, it seems that there are on one hand, they don't care too much about Syria, but on the other hand, they're willing to act cautiously, but to give an opportunity to the new regime to prove itself. We saw the easing of some of the economic sanctions that impose on the country. So it would be very interesting to see, where the Americans are heading when it comes to Syria. But the Israeli interest is quite clear to maintain the forces until things will be clear.
No, thank you. So we have about 5 minutes left. And we have a couple of questions. So let's see how we go. There's one question about the Captagon production and trade. Do we know if it has been shut down completely, or is it still a concern?
So the Captagon industry was flourished during the Assad regime and was a matter of concern for many regional countries, especially Jordan and Saudi Arabia. But that was the main source of income for the regime. And, amazingly, I mean, we've been following this phenomena for many years. And, unlike countries like Colombia, the situation in Syria was peculiar because the regime was part of the industry, or the regime was part of sent forces to be part of the manufacture process and distributing the drug. It wasn't, there wasn't like a central regime who fight the cartels. The regime was the cartel. Now that Assad is gone, Ashara, and this is another positive step that I haven't mentioned there before, is been trying to block the drug industry. Is arresting drug dealers, and shutting down laboratories that produce the drug. So it's going on a positive path here. I think that the main goal, apart from keeping and avoiding situation that undermine the stabilization in Syria by the fact that a lot of Syrians used to consume this drug, it also has signals. It also signals the neighboring country that is doing some positive measures in order to help them to get rid of this wide expansion of the drug in their countries, and by that to gain regional legitimacy. So far it looks good. It's been quite effective in blocking the drug industry, but of course it's going to be a long-term process. there are still, even if it's not part of the system and part of the regime as it used to be, there's more independent cell who, you know, choose to deal with the drug as a source of income in light of the dire economic situation. So it will take time, but it's going on the right way.
Thank you. So we have a couple of more questions that are mostly about Gaza and about the resumption of the war there. So I know that this is not really the topic, but maybe if you know, again, can perhaps link, the general strategic environment, for Israel with regard to the situation, regard to the sort of main issues on the table in Israel today, which is, of course, the resumption of the war in Gaza, the impact on the hostages, and the position of the government as well. How does all of this factor into Syria policy from your perspective?
So I think, as I said earlier, I think there are two dimensions. They're highly influenced, you know, that stems from the recent year and a half and the terrible year and a half that we had. Those two components completely shape our strategy vis-a-vis Syria as well as other neighboring countries. And it's the trauma of October 7. I keep repeating it, but it's important. And this is something that it's definitely on the table. The question is how we do not allow us to be dragged by this trauma and to be influenced by this trauma into a negative, by drawing a negative policy of relying on military force and continuing the war in other fronts. We need to see how, again, we can translate those military achievements to diplomatic efforts and gains. As in the case of Lebanon, I think what's going on right now in Lebanon is quite amazing. I mean, the fact that we've been struggling Hezbollah and inflicted a severe blow to this organization and its dominance in Lebanon, and now we started hearing about negotiations with so it started with a very tactical and operational ceasefire, but now it's expanded to much more strategic discourse and diplomatic discourse. They're talking about settlement of the land border issue and perhaps even sometime in the future to reach a normalization with Lebanon. We keep hearing also voices that indicating for this direction. So this is the right way. I think that this is the most important thing, to translate our military achievement into political gains. And we're tired. We're tired in Israel of war, and we're all very upset to wake up yesterday morning to hear about the renewed military conflict in Gaza. There is an open wound in Israel, obviously, the hostages issue, and until they will not return back to Israel, I don't think that anyone here will be satisfied with all the military achievement that we managed to gain. This is nothing compared to bringing our families and friends back home. And as I said, now the current strategy is to put more pressure, more military pressure, in order to get a ceasefire with Hamas and to reach a new deal that will allow to release the hostages. I'm not sure that Hamas is playing on the same is on the same page with us. I truly hope, and a lot of people around me hope, that we'll start at a better year, less, rely on our military capabilities and force, and started to see some much more calm period and diplomatic initiatives. We all wish that the current government eventually will know how to translate its spectacular achievements.
Thank you so much, Carmit. We're just past 10 o'clock, and I think that is the right note to end on. This has been an incredibly rich and informative discussion. We feel really fortunate to be able to host you on this webinar, and of course, you have a standing invitation to come visit us on campus on your next visit to Washington. So hopefully we'll see you again. And thank you for your time, and thank you to everyone at INSS for all of the excellent work that you continue to do.
Thank you, Jonathan. My pleasure.
All the best. Bye.
Bye-bye.